All right, Sam. Thank you. Thank you again for taking the time to jump in and chat with me a little bit on the topic of identity and access management, IAM. Before we jump in to some of the questions and what we really wanted to talk about, some of what we've learned, the history, what people should be focusing on, I think maybe take just a quick moment and give me a quick introduction of yourself, your role at Concord, and your work with identity and access management over the years.
Yeah, sure. At Concord, I'm a security principal in general. I work on cloud and security-based projects as an engineer and as an architect. But specifically lately, I've been focusing on IAM projects, both from like a SaaS, like an authentication and authorization perspective, as well as from like an enterprise management perspective, which are like the two consumer-based fields for our services. And I've been focusing on them just because there's a lot of need for consultancy in those areas. They require more strategy than is generally perceived. And oftentimes technical implementation, especially on the SaaS side, is an unclear roadmap for most organizations. Whereas on the enterprise side, the roadmap is usually clear. However, a lot of folks struggle with the detail of implementation and then with technical implementation as well.
Nice, nice. So both of us, obviously, we've worked together for a number of years, and we're not spring chickens, right? We've been around for a while. Both of us have been in the information cybersecurity field for many years, decades, really. And when I reflect back on it, in my mind, identity and access management, IAM, is one of the original, to me, foundational information security controls, one of the OG controls and ways to protect data. And let me explain a little bit more. When I'm thinking back in the early days of information, when there was less technology in our lives, less computer chips, less computer systems running our daily lives. And of course, I'm oversimplifying, but essentially, information was stored in mainframes in one central location, one standalone system. So it was easier to protect, and it was core to protect those systems by making sure only the appropriate people could access it. So I guess where I'm going with this is, I'd love to get some of your thoughts and your perspective on how have you seen and experienced IAM in your career in the world of information cybersecurity over the years, from kind of when you first started and the role it played then to where we are now with IAM?
I actually like this question, and I really like that you gave your perspective on this because I know your perspective is a little bit different from mine, right? Whereas like you've been focused and responsible for like the GRC aspect of this, and I've been focused on the implementation. And what's funny about this to me when you bring this up, like, oh, this is like the OG control. And like I remember my first roles where we had mainframes, and it was like most of the access assigned on the mainframe was like literally like a mainframe admin's phone going off and then picking up the phone and being like, hey, I got a new employee, Emily Stoltz, give her access now.
Yeah.
Like she needs to start today. And then like access was granted. And to like say that there was some kind of like control or policy there makes me laugh because I'm certain the company had one on, but like I'm certain if Emily Stoltz didn't get it, that like, some VP was going to run down the hall and be like, hey, administrator, like, why haven't you assigned her access yet?
Yeah. It was all centralized. There was no decentralization. There was one Joe down the hall, right? Yeah.
Yes, like this is, so like, it's actually kind of funny because in implementation, to me, it looks like everything has changed. And to you, it might look like, don't get me wrong, like certainly like compliance standards have changed,
Yep.
but like, it looks like there was a control in the first place. And to me back then, it was kind of like, I wasn't aware of any of those controls. Certainly I was aware that like things like controls existed, but like we were more like fly by the seat of your pants in most organizations. And I say that there were some very, very large enterprises, and certainly in the DoD for certain systems, we had access requirements, but even those were getting skirted. If I'm talking like, 2007 and like just prior, like we were, like those things were being skirted because there weren't ways of enforcing them. So that's probably like, one of the first ways we talk about technically is like certainly the programmability, the extensibility of all these systems. has allowed us to actually enforce these controls from a technical level. So like from that perspective, that's a huge change because now the OG controls you're talking about actually became enforceable. So that's like one example, but just generally, I think we went from like light controls that were typically like, if they were actually implemented and enforced in an organization, or at least in the places I was, and these were like DoD, manufacturing, healthcare, et cetera, they were more of like an afterthought if they were enforced. So policies existed, they weren't necessarily enforced. If there was an audit that required to them, they'd be somewhat enforced or they'd be pencil whipped after the fact for the most part. Not as a result of like, myself or people I worked with, but as a result of just organizational norms back then. It was more about showing the things rather than like doing them on a daily basis. More often it was about doing them operationally and then making sure we like controlled for the audit material like 5 minutes later. Like, not super negligent or anything, but certainly it wasn't like today where like the form doesn't allow you to move on without the manager approval, right? Or without the request intake form or whatever. But yeah, they were more like proactive afterthoughts if they were enforced. Enforcing them was different because the systems didn't have that extensibility at the time. And like certainly differences in implementation and tooling exist today, but I don't think like there's necessarily a huge difference like within an industry's compliance boundary. Like PCI is still PCI, HIPAA high tech is still HIPAA high tech. Certainly for anybody like selling things or dealing with customer info, like the NIST standards still exist for consumer-based industries. So like all of that's the same. From a bird's eye view, the way I explain this the best is I could go down this list of, implicit versus explicit access, et cetera. Like, I'm ChatGPT could kick us out a whole list. I like to focus on this weird concept in tech, and it doesn't just apply to identity, but it applies to kind of everything in with tech. And it's basically that like the way you start on like a given technology and what you iterate to often goes from centralized to fully distributed. But then when you have a technology paradigm shift, it tends to go back to centralized. There are things that aren't quite there, like microservices kind of are an exception to that rule. But in identity, this is certainly the rule. And generally for identity and for IAM and for managing identity and access, it was everything existed at the mainframe. Other systems were like probably not controlled because they didn't have control data. They didn't have compliance requirements. And so all of your access requirements and all of your passwords and identities and role assignments, if you had roles back then, existed right there on the mainframe. Yep. And then we went to like distributed systems where it was like, well, we're customizing mainframes too heavy, and that becomes a problem because they don't have the extensibility to do everything an industry might want to do. And so we get to distributed systems. We get to like best of breed, where it's like, we'll buy a ledger, we'll buy an ERP, we start integrating things. Maybe our inventory is done on a separate system entirely, ordering and supply chains done on a different system entirely. And now you have this network of systems. And now today we have this huge network of systems thanks to internet microservices. But essentially we went from centralized to distributed. And we saw that with our identities, where all of these systems had different identities. And we said, shoot, we have identity sprawl. Now for scope and scale, we can't keep track of who has what access because most of those systems were like shadow IT owned by independent departments. And so like an internal security team or even like a global level administrator within a tech department couldn't tell you what access someone in your company has or if they've been properly terminated. They might still have access to a payroll system, for example. And that was common. And so what we did is we went from centralized to distributed. And then to solve this problem of identity sprawl, we went back to centralized with like, the federation standards, right? At first it was ADFS with WSFed, and then we went like SAML OIDC, and now we can federate back to a centralized place where we have the single identity, the single set of access controls that have the extensibility to enforce the OG controls that you're talking about that still exist today. And so like, you know, this doesn't just happen for identity, it happens for applications. Like I think a famous example of that is mainframe, branch offices, and distributed companies. We go to like fractionally distributed applications at the branch office. And then when we have a paradigm shift where like scale and size, like network bandwidth becomes a limiting factor, well, now with AI, because of bandwidth limitation, AI all kind of has to like live in a single data center with like super, like super powerful interconnects in order to function. And so like um, that whole flow of iteration from centralized to decentralized back to centralized kind of applies here. And we might see it happen again because in other areas it's
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's a really interesting point about, I'll say that hub and spoke model of centralization out and then the shift back. I have a follow-up question for that I'll put a pin in and I'll ask you in a little bit regarding IAM tooling and products that I want to get to. But along the same kind of theme about, we're kind of talking now about what makes IAM so hard, right? Why do so many organizations struggle with it? And maybe it's just my experience, but over in my career, in my experience over the years, I've seen a lot of, and this is somewhat common with IT projects in general, but IAM projects, initiatives tend to go over budget, run long. Organizations struggle with them. And I think there's a number of reasons for that, but I try to peel that back and ask why. And again, you've touched on a few, but to a point you made earlier, my perspective, I like to joke with people, I'm a recovering IT auditor. I'm always kind of coming at it from the compliance, control, risk mitigation standpoint, things here. But when I think about the domain of IAM, to me, to your point, those controls, the risk reduction, the essence of IAM has really remained unchanged over the years to me. It's been focused on, it's ensuring the right people have the right access at the right time with an audit trail. And that the formula for that, if you will, is, you have an identity, you have to prove an identity, you get authorizations, and then you have to record activity. And those components of IAM still are the heart of IAM. But again, back to why do so many organizations struggle with it? And I think there's a couple key things to me. There's the explosion of identities overall, right? Like you said, everything had its own distributed identity. It's just the explosion of systems, trying to scale all of that. I know that's just the complexity of scale makes it hard, but IT has solved, scale in other domains of IT. So why do we still struggle with it in IAM? I guess that's a question I reflect on. Why is IAM continue to be so hard, even though the components of what we're trying to do with it are the same?
That's a good question. I'll start with like the first, and then we should probably go back to the example you brought up, right? Of like, why is it still so hard from like an implementation perspective, which I think is different from this, but certainly like why IAM is still hard, like for me, always boils down to like two or three things. Number one, a lack of initial strategy. And this is probably generically true. Like it's less of an IAM answer and it's more of like a, hey, why do our plans fail? And it's like, because we had inadequate plans. Like, planning to a T means like crossing your T's. Like oftentimes what I see in like software development is, like a lot of our plans are swag, right? And our plan for like that day of implementing something is done the day of. And that's certainly adequate if like, for example, the software you're developing has a general strategy and you have general patterns and stuff for it. But I don't see that in IAM. In IAM, what you usually walk into, certainly with a single software product, you can reestablish strategy quite quickly and turn it around in like a year. In an enterprise at a very small company, yes, you can do that. I have done that for smaller companies where I've re-strategized, re-baselined, and 100% completely centralized their access controls and identities in like a year or less. But the problem is like most companies that we work with and most companies seeking IAM enterprise strategy and implementation help don't fit that. They're completely decentralized and they probably have business units owning different pieces of software and they probably have interconnected parts. And so it becomes strategy. That's a big shift to move. You have to realign on strategy. You probably bought a whole bunch of products that don't all federate the same way. We certainly see this at customers where they're like, well, we bought this, like, we're centralizing on this IDP, we bought these automation tools, et cetera. And then you go, well, like all these products that you own don't have hooks for these products. And they're like, well, wait a second, they have APIs. And it's like, yeah, but their APIs don't support like user provisioning, deprovisioning, all the time, et cetera, which is odd to think, but there are many products, in fact, like name brand products that you would assume have these features that don't. And then it's like they don't fit in. And so establishing that strategy early on and then working with your business partners to make technical requirements, like this is like one of these, again, generic things is non-functional requirements, especially for identity and access, need to be a part of your software selection criteria. Like it can't just be like whatever product is best for that business unit. It certainly can if you want to have identity sprawl and you want to accept that risk for whatever that product does. But if you're in an industry where you can't, you have compliance requirements, then like those NFRs need to be a part of the selection process because we find that a company that doesn't have strategy, doesn't get that stuff baked into software selection, finds themselves in a situation where it's like, well, we can't implement an IAM program because we have to use 12 different protocols and processes in order to manage all of our systems. And that becomes not worth the ROI. Like there's just no.
What you're saying is really resonating. And I'm almost, I don't know if I want to chuckle or cry when I think about some of the experiences I've had with clients in the back. But again, to your point, it's somewhat the same story just with any IT project and not falling into the trap. But your point of strategy to requirements, tying that into what you're actually trying to achieve. I have been involved with clients myself that had that purchased an IGA tool, and they had a audit finding that I think in the case I'm thinking about, they weren't doing access reviews, and they had an audit finding. They weren't doing access reviews for their systems, in scope systems. So they went out and bought an IGA tool, which is kind of like buying a really big bat to kill a mosquito if you're just focused on one thing. But so they bought this big product to go do access reviews, and then they realized as they were implementing it, like, wow, we spent a lot of money on this IGA tool. It can do a lot more than access reviews, and they just started turning things on. And well, we should connect systems to it. We should do that. To your point, there was no strategy. There was no identity program. They were just enabling features and again, not that trying to connect systems is wrong, but they had no guiding principles, no goals, no requirements. And they struggled mightily in their journey because they didn't have clear understanding of where they were and where they wanted to be and what success looked like. I think that's what what you're saying, and that I'm resonating with is before you start doing. We live in the waterfall methodology where we're in the iterative space. I get that, and I'm not speaking that should go away or not be a thing, but before you start, what are we trying to achieve here? Basic questions, right?
Yeah, this kind of goes back to like the old thing about like the majority of implementation problems that I've had with systems acquired by different companies when it comes to like IAM implementation and like including them in the IAM strategies. It's like going back to software selection criteria. Like, I don't know if you've ever used this process. I've used a lot of different processes. I've certainly like advocated for and had my own processes adopted, but like the checklist of like, for this piece of software, here are need to haves and here are nice to haves. And here are, these would hurt, but these like don't make or break. And certainly in this top category, it's if it doesn't do one of these things, right? We can't select the software. In here, it's kind of like, this is the stuff that makes or breaks a tie. And then at the bottom, it's like, these are nice to haves. But I think what often gets overlooked is NFRs often belong in that top category because, for example, if your company is a certain size and scale, like for example, you need to have 15,000 users on a given system, and this system is built for smaller industry and it can't scale to like the workload you need. Well, who cares if it does all the functional requirements? It doesn't function at your scale, so it's not going to work for your implementation anyways. And certainly like identity might not be up in there. For a high compliance industry, identity probably belongs in here. In an average like consumer based industry, it probably belongs like in this middle category of like, these things are really nice to have and they should be tiebreakers. But identity certainly never belongs down here unless you're in an industry that's completely unregulated and having access to that system is of no risk to your organization. So I tend to think that that process solves most of the problems that we see in IAM programs because they're like second, third order, fifth order effects of not doing that, even though they might be highly technical problems, a result of like, oh, the product wasn't OIDC compatible, which is something we just saw at a recent client where they had a product that needed to integrate, wasn't OIDC compatible. Fortunately, we were able to build some like custom middleware to like make it work. But again, that was an expensive endeavor that most companies might not be able to afford.
Again, that technical debt that can really creep up. You're not if you're not in a greenfield environment, there's that technical debt can change those requirements, right? Can impact. Let me ask you this too, Sam. So we're talking a good conversation about some just general challenges with IAM projects, programs, initiatives. Again, some of these apply to just any IT environment as well. But let me maybe put you on the spot a little bit here. Many times in life, I think about, we can learn more from failures than we can successes, or remember them much more, at least. If you think back to IAM efforts and projects that you've been involved with over the years or observed, can you think of any aha or key moments or something, an unforgettable lesson or mistake or something that you'll never make again or would say, okay, we're going to avoid this at all costs? Is there anything that jumps out to you along those lines from an IAM implementation or initiative that you've been involved with?
Yes, less so on IAM. So I'm not going to like talk about off topic. Like I certainly have really good examples of like, professional life lessons I've learned from like, just biting off more than I can chew, like not having appropriate buy-in before moving on something that's like technically better, but not contextually better for the business. For example, like things like that. But in IAM, I feel like it's, don't get me wrong, all of that exists in IAM. Certainly not having a strategy to begin with and not having a documented, like guiding principles level adopted IAM strategy before biting off an IAM roadmap is one of those. That is a recipe for disaster every time. I know you've seen that. I've seen that. We've had conversations about this in the past. IAM is not something a security team can bite off by themselves. Certainly engineering, like your tenant and domain and system administrators like have to be bought in. Their leadership needs to be bought in because most of this stuff happens in implementation. Executive buy-in is needed because a lot of this stuff like IAM automation, for example, like requires hooks into your like payroll or HRIS systems and other systems like that. And so like, if you have a business unit that's not willing to play ball because there is an executive buy-in, that's a recipe for success. So the wheels need to be greased before you can drive that race. From an implementation perspective, I would say it's more commonly it's trusting in inventory. I think most organizations that fail in implementation and not on strategy it's because their inventory of what they have and what's compatible isn't realistic. Almost every single inventory that I have seen from an admin, like from a set of network engineers, system admins, global admins, et cetera, on Access, is highly incomplete. And not just from a like size perspective, but also from like a scope of effort perspective. Oftentimes, like it's just like, yes, the product is SSO capable, and there's not a look at like, okay, how is it SSO capable? Because there are different protocols, and certainly even within those protocols, there's different flows and like sometimes proprietary mechanisms they use. And having an inventory of that stuff allows you to scope your project so you don't overspend. If you know that stuff ahead of time, you can plan for it, and you can like keep stuff in scope that's worth the money. But oftentimes what we see is we'll like start on an app, integrating an app, and then we get into it and it's like, well, we need like a custom token exchange flow because of how you want to integrate this. This app may be SSO capable, but it doesn't use a modern protocol. And on top of that, like it's looking for an issue where you have a proxy. And those are two different things, for example. So, again, that's probably more technical than this conversation needs to be, but it is an example of where, both from strategy you fall off, and then where you can fall off in implementation. And certainly there's hundreds of micro examples of where you can fail in implementation. But in my experience, almost all of them come back to you bit off, applying a strategy to a product that doesn't fit into your strategy technically. And I know most people go, well, like it's a product, it has extensibility, we'll program it. And it's like, yeah, but those things do come at a cost. And sometimes that stuff is, when you start programming those things, now you have to look at edge cases and sustainability and future releases as they upgrade that product. And like that stuff becomes expensive, and then it becomes a long-term maintenance strip that most of us forget about. So
I love how I really resonate with your answer actually too, and I love how I think our different experiences and viewpoints from IAM are coming through in our answers and how we're kind of talking about these problems together. Because your point about inventory and really scope, right, and biting off, absolutely agree with what you were saying with that. And what that made me think about is a lot of the, again, from a compliance standpoint, a lot of the projects and programs I've been involved with over the years were implementing identity governance. We're coming at it from a governance requirement. And one of the aha moments or lessons that I've learned from that, again, these companies have been implementing a needing to implement more controls around typically reviewing access and approving access have been kind of the main drivers. And one of my lessons learned is when doing this, too often people get right into the implementation phase. And I'm a big stickler because there is a distinct lack of, and it's somewhat ironic, I don't know why this continues to happen or I continue to see it, but people don't want to take the time. It feels like, I don't know, wasted effort or too slow or whatever, but they don't take the time up front to, again, inventory, to assess and document all of the as-is workflows to say, if we need, what are all the systems and platforms components that we need to control, and for those, what are the as-is processes and workflows today, and make sure you have a good understanding of how the process looks today, because we're going to slap a technology on it. We're going to automate it, right? Typically, it's making a process faster. It's making sure there's more sign-offs or audit checks in there. That's why they're implementing a tool or a platform. But everybody just wants to jump to the implementation phase, and lo and behold, when we don't understand or have good understanding of how the processes work today, we just throw any tool on top of it or try to replace those processes with a tool. They're typically not just one process or use case. There's usually, well, these apps use it this way, and then we have this one over here that's a standalone, and people don't account for all of those, the inventory of as-is processes today. They just start running with it. So that's something that's always jumped out to me, is just making sure, taking the time up front to really document what we have today, and then, to your point, what we've been talking about, tie it back to the strategy. What are we trying to achieve? Then we figure out how are we going to get there. So
I had that in there for fails. I didn't talk about it because it wasn't like a personal one,
Yeah.
but it is the one I most commonly experience with organizations when working with them, where it's like I feel responsible for it personally, but it's like, again, this is a responsibility like on an organization before opting into these projects is processes. So like one of the reasons why like IAM is seemingly hard again goes back to this like lack of planning, lack of strategy, and it's like IAM processes work in your organization before automation, like before buying an IGA and an automation tool, for example. They work because you have help desk folks who run down the hall, ask a question, call a manager on a phone from a team and be like, hey, what do I need to do with this ticket? The team gets it. It doesn't have the details. The engineer's like trying to assign the access, and it's like a weird thing because this person converted from contractor, they have an old identity, they forward it back to the help desk. The help desk enables their old account, sends the access request back to the engineering team. The engineering team doesn't have all the details because like maybe the role wasn't correct in it or well defined in it. So the engineering team calls the person up or emails them, gets the answer, signs the access. Well, like that process that we just described is plenty adequate when there are humans involved. That process is not adequate at all for automation. And this comes as a surprise. Like, I think it's pretty easy if you're running, you know, 3,000 unique processes out of your service desk that you're not aware of this one thing unless you're like working in an old bullpen style environment. Like,
Yeah.
years ago when I managed the service desk, we had 50 agents and we were all in a bullpen together. And I was like the service desk manager at the time, along with another guy working 12-hour shifts. And that was 12 hours a day where we'd have to hear about every problem that came up. So we were aware of these things. But that doesn't exist today because it's all automated in these systems. Um, and like when a human agent has to do all this stuff, it's from a remote location, right? And so like these don't boil to the surface. So like a security team will be like, we have existing IAM processes, we just want to automate them. In reality, like they don't have a process that is mature enough. And so going back to that like requirement stage and then that replanning stage is often something like there's like quite a bit of resistance or reluctance to do. I should say reluctance is a better word to do, but it will again will fail the implementation of an IGA tool.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and it's the most common thing for IGA implementation, at least in my perspective.
I agree. I agree. Uh, okay. So we've talked a little bit about we've talked a little bit about the history of IAM and where identity controls kind of started and how they were impactful back in the day when our technology world was simpler. We talked about some of the struggles today in with modern identity programs projects. Talked about some of the lessons learned, things we wouldn't do again, or the things we've really seen people struggle with. To wrap it up and bring it, I guess, full circle a little bit here, let's talk maybe then the last topic question is along the lines of, so where do we go from here? And I ask that, I break it down. I think about all the various components of identity in my mind. I think about authentication and things like the single sign-on, MFA, two-factor authentication, now pass keys, things like that. So authentication, there's authorization and centralized governance and privileged account management, some of that. There's access monitoring, and not to mention there's the vendors that play in all of these spaces, right? And all of these categories. When we take this all in and think about it right now, if you say, okay, we're at an inflection point or we're dealing with these struggles, all of these major components and capabilities of identity today, is there something that you think organizations should be focusing on specifically in terms of an IAM program or capability for those organizations? Is there something that you think, my top priority for any organization, if I go into a new client, if I go to a new organization, their IAM program really needs to be looking at and fixing and improving X? Is there something that is at the top of your list or top of your mind right now?
Yes. In fact, I'll call it a frustration. Not because I'm like emotionally distressed by it, but because of like I have an extreme passion about this particular topic, and not just with IAM, but in other domains of security and engineering as well. In fact, it's very frustrating over and over to like be in organizations that want to bite off a big security roadmap, and it has all of these, very what I think are, like advanced applications, right? Like, okay, PAM. Don't get me wrong, PAM is a great thing. Um, um, having like and pimmable access certainly is too, right? Like just in time access and stuff like that. And getting into stuff like that is awesome. Certainly IGA is awesome. But what I always see is the organization doesn't understand what its actual problems are. Again, the inventory of assets and issues isn't factual, and they want to bite off a PAM and an IGA implementation, and it's going to cost them like $2.5 million to like do these two things, for example, for like a mid-cap company, right? Just because of the size and scope of what they're dealing with. And well, there's a bunch of things they could do for free with full-time employees or with contractor support for less money that has a more sizable impact. And like what I'll get into here is brilliance in the basics. Is your strategy in place? Like, and the number one thing about strategy today is all of your systems federated and all of your identities on a single IDP behind a set of access controls, contextual. Are you group nesting so that adjacent access can occur? Do you have, like, an example of that one is if you have service desk agents who are group administrators in your directories, what is the point of PIM and PAM when a service desk agent who's executing a script and trying to fill in the blanks in between can assign administrator level access to various systems or assign access to a group that can assign access to one of those groups? Like, if you have group nesting going on in your organization, I have no idea why you would go on to bite off a PAM project. Your privileged access is already fully escalatable without governance or controls over it. And I see this, like, that example everywhere. And again, like, it's a frustration because I bring it up and people were like, PAM will protect us from that. And I'm like, no, PAM will not protect you against that at all. Like, certainly shared accounts can go in PAM. And certainly if you have separate accounts or administrator access, they can go in there. But if they're getting that access via groups,
Yep.
and groups are assignable based on various escalations, especially at level 1 or 2 support, that is a major hole in your entire strategy where it's like cool, like you can avoid the control entirely, like no technical control exists on it in that state. And so I go back to that. I go back to, like, you need to do the directory and group and access basics.
Yeah.
And you need to meet Microsoft, like, for example, with Azure at least, and with AD, meet your Microsoft baselines, meet your OWASP baselines for software if we're going generic. And if you, so like, meet your baselines for like NIST, OWASP, like whatever frameworks you want to work off of, meet those. Meet your platform basics. So if you're going to be in like AWS or GCE, meet those baselines. Microsoft has really strong ones. Meet theirs, and then go bite off your IGA or PAM or whatever program. But like, why do those things if you know what I mean? Like, if you can't do the basics, like, there's no reason to buy $1 million security system if you're just not going to have a front door. And that's
Yeah,
kind
I'm
of
just gonna say it's a completely back door, right? It's like Swiss cheese. You're putting all this energy and effort, and yet it can be circumvented through this hole in the system. Quick quick fun fact for you. Side note here, fun fact, and this might come back to haunt me a little bit if I share this. But so here's a complete IT geek moment for you that I know you'll appreciate. Not everybody does, but your whole point about nested groups. I dealt with that back with Active Directory years ago, and nested permissions and the complexities that that introduced. One year, Sam, I went for Halloween as a nested AD group with a friend of mine. So, I mean, that's a complete IT geek. That's really geeking out there. But yeah, so I was a nested AD group for Halloween one year. So pretty
That's
bad.
fantastic.
Yeah, it's pretty. Nobody got it. Let me tell you.
That's a topic that used to frustrate me because the answer to nested groups would always be, well, it's too complicated to assign all this access, then we need independent groups for everything. And I'm like, so you need, you know, explicit access versus implicit access, and that's a problem. And they'd be like, right, but the size of them, it's so many clicks. And I'd be like, you haven't learned shell scripting yet? I'm like literally the junior level Microsoft certs for managing AD included shell scripting even as far back as 2003. And it's like, there were so little questions on them back in those days. And like 2012ish, they changed it. But back in that day, you could like pass your MCSE, like an expert level, an expert level certification because you could like fail the few questions on shell scripting. But like around 2012, they went to it where it was like, well, this is a requirement now. And so it's like, there was an answer to that. Microsoft created an answer and it was very simple. Like, learn how to query and script, and then you can manage all of your implicit access groups instead of having these, or explicit access groups, instead of just having this like wild unknown implicit access. Even recently, I was in a Reddit cybersecurity thread. I say recently, this was probably like 2 or 3 days ago. You could go look it up. Somebody said, "Hey, we just had a vulnerability testing consultancy group visit our enterprise, and one of the findings was that Domain Computers is a member of Domain Admins. Please explain to me how this is a risk."
Wow.
This was like 2 or 3 days ago on Reddit. And like, again, that could be a troll for fun, right? Like maybe,
So
maybe a
everyone
vendor
had
put that in
domain
there
access.
for market research. Yeah. Like
Wow.
maybe a vendor put it in there for market research, but like it seemed like a genuine post. The poster had like a genuine history. Again, this might be a genuine history of somebody who works in the industry, like posting these things to get a feel for if these are still problems. But I suspect they still are based on some of the things I've seen out.
Again, I say we still, the industry in general still, again, controls, security can inevitably slow things down. And that's always one of the challenge, right? Um, and the just efficiency and speed. Our world is only sped up, right? We have no time for delays. And as security experts, if we're introducing delays, blockers, if it's not automated, it's a real struggle. I think it's a real struggle. So everybody gets, to your point, give everybody domain admin access. That'll solve it. No problem.
That's an entire topic for probably another one of these, right? A parallel topic is like, how do I do IAM program implementation without like slowing down teams? And there's an enterprise version of that, and then there's a like, if you're a software reseller version of, or not reseller, but if you're if you're a software developer version of that as well, how you can like work those things in parallel. And like we have expertise with both of those things, with how you put those things in and not have to bother like individual business units and slow down your development teams in the process. So yeah.
Yeah,
I
I agree. There's a whole host of subtopics and areas we can take and further explore identity. I think there's a lot to it, and a lot of people are focused on it. It's important. So maybe more to come from some of these conversations here. But thank you for your time. Thank you for again. I think what we're both what I took away from this, and what I think we both see from different perspectives, but see is we've talked a lot about understanding your scope, understanding your goals, understanding and being clear about where you are today and how the processes and technologies today before you start implementing, before you start trying to tackle a problem. Don't just throw a tool at it. Understand, and then understand what success looks like. What are the metrics? What are we trying to achieve? And not skipping those core components, because without that, you really can't define an IAM program. You're without those things, you're kind of just chasing your tail with specific problems, and those tend to snowball and never ends well.
Yeah. Also, just engage us early, right? Like if you're looking to do one of these programs, like I think we all know this, right? With any, like generically, with anything, consulting an expert earlier is going to save you a lot of time. Like the later you consult an expert on something, consider the implication of building a home because building software is very, very similar to like high-end construction projects. Consult an expert sooner because that saves you a lot of time and effort down the road. Like the amount that you'll spend on trying to build an IAM program by consulting experts after you have a problem is significantly more, like multiple factors more than it is if you just go, we're starting to look at IAM, come and take a look at it or enterprise for a few weeks and just like give us an idea, right? At least then you have your guiding principles, you have your must haves. And like that's something that doesn't cost a lot of money or time or even effort, right? And just like prevents you from making all these mistakes that become like, what we see, like they become projects that are like 6 and 7 figures that really could have been alleviated with like, a 5 figure price tag in the first place.
Yep. Proper architecture, proper planning up front. I agree. Saves a lot of pain. Wonderful. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob.